World Blitz. Let's see how he fares this time. We have the Sicilian on the board. Magnus goes for knight c3, not playing d4. He's waiting for that move. Moves his bishop out. Pawn comes out to a6. Sarana wanting to keep the game in Najdorf territory. Let's say if Magnus plays d4, we are back in Najdorf. So Magnus takes his time to decide what he wants to play here. He can stop the expansion with a4. He can also play d4 and transpose back to the main lines, or he can castle. That's what he does. He castles it out. And Sarana pushes his pawn to b5. Slightly risky strategy, because if you look at white, he's developed all his pieces, has castled, while black is undeveloped. Magnus now opens up the position. Sarana takes, and now Magnus thinks. There's one idea to take with the queen, but also a very interesting move is knight to d5, sacrificing the pawn. Because if you take here, this is real danger with white having huge lead in development. So a move like knight d5 in such positions is normal, and Magnus, I think, was thinking about it. Bishop f3, very important move. You don't put your pawn on f3 here, because that's a very passive way to play. You play bishop f3, because now in such positions, you have ideas of pushing your pawn forward. So the knight comes to d7, and Magnus hits on this expanded queen side here, which will give him some play. Fantastic chess here by Magnus Carlsen. Now one way to continue for black is to push the pawn to b4, but then after knight d5, it's a good position for white. So Sarana takes the pawn, and now Magnus can take back with the rook. He does so. The rook is well placed. The a6 pawn is slightly weakened. Look at white's development. It's looking good. Sarana must put his knight on e5. No, he goes e6, which is a mistake. And what a quickly played move by Magnus, hitting the bishop. Now, if you notice, the bishop does not have any squares to go to. And the moment you defend the bishop, let's say by queen c7, I just sack and push my pawn, opening up this bishop. So it's a very difficult move to meet. Magnus has played rook b4. Even if you play rook b8, I will sack and push my pawn. So big trouble here for Alexei Sarana here. Magnus's idea of activating his rook from a4 to b4 has worked like a charm. And now Alexei Sarana in big trouble. Keep this idea in mind. The bishop on b7 is running out of squares. Now what should Sarana do here? Another idea is to move his knight to c5 to defend the bishop. Because if you can kick the rook away later on, his position should be completely fine. But it's impossible to do that, because Magnus is going to sacrifice his rook. He goes knight c5, and this is a mistake. Let's see how quickly Magnus wraps his brain around this calculation. So you take, knight takes, you push the pawn, you attack this knight and this knight. Now one move is knight d5 because you block it. But after I take and push my pawn, the king is right in the center. You can see the development is terrible. The knights are beautifully placed. The rook is coming up. The queen is coming in here. So by this calculation, I think Magnus can already think about sacrificing on b7. But it's easier said than done, and Magnus has taken more than 45 seconds to work this thing out. Not at all easy, but he's running low on time. 1 minute 23 seconds left. He takes it. Pushes the pawn. Pawn takes. A check here. So Sarana was also ready, but this intermezzo seems to have thrown him off guard. He has two ideas. One is king e7, other is knight going back. Now if you play king e7, you have to be careful. The bishop can come out from here and checkmate you. So there are two possibilities. Alexei using his time well here to think what is the best way. King e7 seems like the better option, and after you take on b7, take here, take here, take here, it can get very complicated, and after queen f3, white is better. Look at the black's pieces, terribly positioned. And so that's the reason why Sarana must decide whether he needs to move his king up or not. That is the big question here. Well, he goes knight d7. Magnus sacks another knight, takes, check. And now if you play g6, queen takes e5. Notice this is pinned, and I attack the rook and the pawn. So playing this might not be possible. g6. He goes king up. If you go bishop g5 check trying to win the queen, the knight blocks because now there's no pin this side. What a complicated position. For the time being, Magnus is an entire rook down. So he must be careful. He has 1 minute 12 seconds. He takes the knight. Now he's exchanged down. He attacks the rook. Rook b8. Your bishop is hanging. You really want to go bishop g5, but knight f6 saves the day for black. So how do you continue here? Rook d1 played. Very interesting. If you take here, bishop g5 check is the smart thing to do. He goes queen c7. And now the bishop is hanging on b7. And the knight is ready to come here. Next move, if the queen moves away, the king moves out, the bishop comes out, and then black could be an exchange up. So Magnus has to take this carefully. He takes the pawn. Knight comes in and it's time to pin it. Bishop g5. No, he comes back with the queen and suddenly black's position is much okay. You know, it's no longer that bad. Knight e4, but Magnus has shifted from an attacking way of dealing with this position to a more positional approach. All he's saying is that, hey, look at my two bishops and my two outside passers, and I should be able to convert this without having to go into any tactical sequence. Takes here, queen takes, and now Sarana is basically saying, hey, look, my rooks are connected. So in a way, Sarana has improved his position drastically. Rook comes into b4, queen goes back, black's position has begun coordinating, but at the same time, Magnus Carlsen's pawns have started to move forward. Rook goes to a4, the bishop comes back, and now this very classy move, pinning on the first rank. This has limited the bishop's movement, and it seems like black has fought back into the game. I like Magnus's last move, g3, because look at his presence of mind. He just simply improves. First, doesn't trade the rook, and now improves his king position with king g2 so that there are no checks on the last rank. This will come into big use later on. Queen goes to d7, doubling on the d file. Pawn moves forward. Sarana wants to keep his king in the center. The game is now very interesting and exciting. Look at that quickly played move, queen b5. How does Sarana find such moves in just like 1 second? That's a question to me. Magnus has 30 seconds now to work out what to do. His bishop can't move because his rook is hanging. And if the rook cannot move because the bishop is hanging, this is already trouble. He goes g4, bishop g5, mistake. Takes, he gives a check. Is it a mistake? In fact, black's position looks completely fine. He can take it back with the bishop or the pawn. He takes with the pawn. Rook takes. It's equal material now. Take the pawn on b2. No, he comes in. That's a blunder. Check. Now if the king moves, it's a mate. So in comes this fork. Rook had to go back and it's game over.